So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tony Simmons. Tony's a member of our committee and a professor at Athabasca University, and he's going to talk to us about why Canada needs to get out of Afghanistan.
Thanks very much, Peggy. It's good to be here today on such a beautiful day. And I would like to thank all of you who've come out today and to congratulate you, because most of the faces that I'm looking at, I've been looking at for the past 7 years since the invasion of Iraq, and some of which for the past 9 years since the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. So I would like to congratulate you all, my brothers and sisters in struggle. And even though we may be a small group today, we all know that we constitute the core, the militant core of the anti-war movement in this city. And unfortunately, because of the way the world is, this is a core which will have to remain and will grow again as the times require us to do so. So as I look back on the invasion, occupation of Afghanistan over the last 9 years, I really don't want to repeat many of the things which have been said before, because we've heard them many times. But I am, for example, reflecting on the fact that the original pretexts for going in both to Iraq and Afghanistan have continuously been changed by the governments who have taken our armed forces in. The original pretext for going into Afghanistan under the misuse of the United Nations Charter, Article 51, the original pretext for going into Afghanistan was self-defense. The George W. Bush claimed that there would be other attacks like the 9/11 attacks. But it didn't take long to realize that there were no Afghan nationals taking part in the terrorist attacks. The terrorists came from other countries, but not, as you know, from Afghanistan. And so the pretext changed. It changed to counter-terrorism. We're after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But there again, it didn't take long to realize that Al-Qaeda was long gone. It had fled to the border regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan. There were less than 100 Al-Qaeda members at the time of the invasion, according to CIA estimates themselves. And so again, we find a change of pretext, and the counter-terrorism becomes counterinsurgency. That's why we're in Afghanistan. We're fighting the resistance to our own invasion and occupation. And this, of course, continues to be one of the main pretexts and excuses used by the UN and the NATO forces for its continued occupation of the country. But in addition to that, the Americans have also had the audacity to say, we're in Afghanistan, and the Canadian government agrees with them, for democracy, for the defense of human rights, and dare I say it, for nation building. Now, if you want to see an example of the Americans' attempts at nation building, you've only got to go to Iraq. Because 7 years after the invasion and occupation of Iraq, in many areas of Baghdad and Fallujah and other cities, the electricity still doesn't work for 24 hours a day. The water still has to be rationed. And for all the terrible things that Saddam Hussein may have done during his regime, one thing we do know, that 6 months after the Gulf War was ended, all the electricity and all the water had been restored to the civilian homes in the country. So that's the example of the Americans' attempt at nation building. We don't take it seriously. We take it simply as another excuse for the occupation. So then we can ask ourselves, well, what has the war in Afghanistan really achieved? And the answer, to be brutal and blunt about it, is not an answer that we will ever be given by the government or listened to through the media. Because the first obvious achievement of the war in Afghanistan has been a rising level of casualties and fatalities. Certainly a rising level of civilian casualties in Afghanistan. And we don't even know how to compute the real number, because as the WikiLeaks war diaries have recently exposed, many of the killings of civilians in Afghanistan have been unrecorded and undocumented. They've been hidden, they've been concealed from the public record. We know in Iraq to 2006, the Lancet, the British medical journal, the Lancet estimated 600,000 civilians had been killed in Iraq. In 2010, we know that number has now exceeded 1 million fatalities in Iraq. And this reminds us of Vietnam, because by the time the Americans had finished in Vietnam, they had slaughtered 1 million people in the south and another 1.5 million people in the north. How many people have died in Afghanistan? I wish I could tell you. But we don't know for sure. But we know there are tens of thousands of people that have been done. But another brutal fact, of course, is the rise of our own Canadian casualties. We know there's 152 Canadian soldiers who have been killed in Afghanistan. But there are many more who have returned home with catastrophic battlefield injuries, psychological injuries, and physical injuries. And we know that many of these soldiers, however much we may disagree with the mission, we have to sympathise with the fact that many of these returning soldiers have not been given proper aid and assistance or compensation. In fact, a retired Canadian senior officer, Pat Strogan, who is now the ombudsman for the servicemen and women who have come back, has continually pleaded with the Canadian government to give them adequate financial compensation and adequate medical coverage. This is how we treat returning veterans in this country. In the United States, the same kind of treatment has been expanded. So one brutal fact, what we've achieved is a rising level of fatalities and casualties in the war in Afghanistan. We have also achieved, I suppose, the installation of a corrupt government. We know that the elections last year, the presidential elections in August 2009, were totally flawed. They were marred by intimidation and also by electoral fraud. And we know that the parliamentary elections just this September are subject to all the same problems. Only a quarter of the possible electorate even voted. But the funny thing is that even though Hamid Karzai is a puppet government, even the puppet has some concerns about the slaughter of his own people, the slaughter of innocent Afghans in the country. And repeatedly, Hamid Karzai has criticised the NATO airstrikes and the US airstrikes in an effort to, in some ways, to make the coalition forces more accountable. And he has often said that the NATO forces treat lives cheaply in Afghanistan. At one point he even said, "I will join the Taliban unless something is done about this." So we have succeeded, I suppose, in installing an unpopular and unrepresentative government. No doubt about that. Another achievement, we have committed war crimes. Sorry to be so blunt, but that's part of the reality that we're facing in Afghanistan. War crimes on a number of different scales. Dropping of 500-pound bombs on villages when we've mistaken the gunfiring of weddings for insurgent activity. Thousands of people being killed innocently by misguided intelligence and aerial strikes which have slaughtered people who were not combatants in this war. Many other people have been killed randomly at check stops because the NATO troops are so frightened of bombers that they will shoot any car which doesn't understand their directions to stop. And some of the worst atrocities now are being committed by the so-called black operation squads, the special operations units such as Task Force 373, the United States, and the Canadian Task Force, Joint Task Force 2. To give you one example, we know that earlier this April, that an American Special Operations Force surrounded a house in a place called Kataha, which is just outside Gardez. Surrounded the house, burst in, shot as many people as they could, only to find that this was a celebration of a newly born child, and there were a large number of extended families. When the Americans realized their mistake, they came back and they cut out of the corpses the bullets that they had actually shot. They washed the corpses in alcohol, and then they submitted a fraudulent report to their field commander saying they'd come across this house, several bodies were dead when they came here, they assume it was insurgent activity. Now these reports, to say the least, are very troubling, because we know that in this case it was an American Special Operations Force. But we also know that for 2 years there's been an ongoing investigation against the Canadian Special Operations Force, JFT2, and nobody is telling us what is the basis of that investigation other than it's an inquiry and investigation into so-called unlawful killings. So things could be done in our name, atrocities committed in our name, which none of us want any part of. And all of us, if we had the power, would withdraw our forces and seek to negotiate a diplomatic and political settlement to what is fundamentally a political problem.
Hear, hear.
And finally, in terms of other achievements, I suppose, and perhaps the most significant achievement, negative though it is that this war has destabilized the entire area, the so-called Greater Middle East of Central Asia. For Pakistan, the war has spilled into Pakistan. American Predator Reaper drones are now assassinating, killing from remote-controlled mechanisms insurgent commanders and others that they regard on their lists as individuals to be assassinated. A result of going into Pakistan has certainly destabilized the entire region and has consequences far beyond Afghanistan and Pakistan, into Central Asia, into the oil-rich and natural gas-rich areas of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan as well. So these are some of the achievements of the war, nothing that we would be proud of, nothing that the government would want to take responsibility for. So when we sit back and we think, why has the war continued like this? Of course, we're forced to reflect on who actually is gaining from this war. Who are the people who are profiting? And the answers to that are fairly straightforward. The first set of people to profit, of course, is the arms manufacturing industries, who are profiting mightily. That the Canadian government has just announced another contract, a no-bid contract, of course, with Lockheed Martin for between $6 to $9 million. There's different reports in the press about that. I suspect it's $9 million for the purchase of $6 billion. Fair enough. For the purchase of F-35 stealth fighter jets. But also, along with that purchase, is another commitment to between $6 to $9 billion for ongoing upgrading and maintenance of that equipment. And Harper has argued this means jobs for Canada, but what he doesn't say is that actually much of the work on this will be done not simply in the United States, but Israel, because Israel is a very vital partner in the development of these stealth aircrafts, and much of the building and the maintenance work will be done in Israeli manufacturing centers as well. So the arms industry, Lockheed Martin, or in this country, SAE Lavalin, that's making bullets, or McDonough Detweiler, which helps to make the remote drones, General Dynamics, and so on and so forth. Yes, there are people and there are industries which are profiting mightily from this war. Even though we may not be, they are. And the private purse calls the shots, unfortunately, in the system under which we live. But in addition to that, there are the huge construction companies like Bechtel, for example, the Louis Berger groups, other very large, Halliburton, of course, not to overlook that, making millions of dollars out of contracts given by the American government, much of the money is skimmed off in overheads. Much of the money never finds its way into Afghanistan for development of the civil infrastructure. And in addition to the construction companies, the military contracting companies. Blackwater is the most famous. It's changed its name to XE nowadays. But Blackwater, which recruits military mercenaries from South Africa, from Rhodesia, the former white settler areas from Israel, and for special forces from the UK and the USA, Blackwater answers one very important problem in the United States, and it's one we should be aware of. Because Blackwater provides the military which would otherwise have to be provided by reintroducing the draft. The reason the draft hasn't been reintroduced is because we learned from Vietnam that ratchets up the level of mass opposition to the war. So the US government, realizing this, has decided to go with private military contractors, has avoided using the draft, and 50% of the fighting forces now in Iraq and in Afghanistan are drawn from private military contracting organizations, a fact that we should be very well aware of. And in addition to that, our own province of Alberta has something to gain from the war, because just last week there were 3 US senators who came through here. The most important one was Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. And they were taken on a flying visit to Fort McMurray. Their interest was in the Athabasca oil sands. And they made it clear, particularly Lindsey Graham, who was very candid. He said, "We need your oil. We need your clean oil." By clean oil, he means it comes from a country which is complicit in the US occupation and agrees with US foreign policy. "We need your clean oil, and particularly our military needs your oil." He said that, and he was reported, and he should know, because it's on the Armed Services Subcommittee of the US Senate and on the military procurement committees as well. So Athabasca tar sands, the oil sands itself, is, along with other pipeline agreements with the United States, is helping to feed the US war machine. No question about that. So I suppose that leads to the question, if we know who profits from the war, then who pays the heaviest price? And I suppose the answer to that is fairly straightforward. The people of Afghanistan, without any doubt, pay the heaviest price in terms of the deaths, the fatalities, in terms of the injuries they sustained, in terms of their displacement within the country and their conversion into refugees, having to go to Pakistan or other bordering areas to get out of the conflict zone. So the people of Afghanistan, who have shown in the few polls which have been administered in Afghanistan, they don't want conflict and combat. They don't want the foreign forces there, because they see that as endemic to the conflict which is taking place in their own country. So the Afghan people are the first and heaviest victims of this war. But Canadians also are paying a price. We're paying a price in terms of our dead soldiers who are coming back, and the soldiers who are coming back with the catastrophic battlefield injuries. But we are paying a price in other ways, because the money which is being spent on the war could otherwise have been spent on social investments, in healthcare, in housing, in childcare, in educational upgrades, in a whole number of different ways. The price we pay for the war is to forego public spending in other areas. And besides that, we pay a price with our opposition for the increasing restriction and repression of our political freedoms. As anyone who watched the G20, the G8 demonstrations the other day saw, the Toronto police were forced, in a sense, to become dogs on a leash for the Harper government. And it's a matter of time before the repression of the anti-globalization protests are turned to repression of the anti-war movement. So where do we go from here? Well, the great political writer George Orwell once wrote that in an age of universal deceit, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act. And for all of us who face a government right now which is selling out our sovereignty, selling out our independence, simply for a place at the table of the US empire, the crumbs that fall from the US, a government which is committing war crimes and which is in contravention of our international obligations and international law, and the government which has hijacked our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as it did, for example, when it was complicit in the torture of Khadr and sent CSIS to interrogate Khadr, knowing that he had been tortured. All of this is part of the same picture. It's a government which is selling out our heritage as decent Canadians. And so if speaking the truth in times of deceit is a revolutionary act, then all of us need to become revolutionaries. Thank you.